Am I audible? Good. I affirm that the U.S. should guarantee a right to housing. The goal for this round should be to eliminate homelessness. Homelessness is a really, really bad thing, in case you didn't already need an explanation to know why. Being homeless increases your chance for mental health problems. It increases disproportionately your chance for suicide, and especially among youth, increases your propensity to get involved in crime and also into drugs. I mean, think about it. If you are homeless, it means you have next to nothing, and you're probably going to need to either beg or steal for whatever you get. Homelessness doesn't help anyone. Now, the reason we should guarantee a right to housing, which, by the way, a right to housing means that it's a legal entitlement, that it would be provided for all people because they are citizens. It would cost only about $20 billion to solve the issue of homelessness. That's from the Housing and Urban, an official of the Housing and Urban Development, as well as, by the way, we spend 30 times that on education. So let's do the right thing. Let's help society, and let's end homelessness as much as we can.
Okay, so first on his goal of eliminating homelessness, of course, if you're going to provide housing, you're going to decrease it. But what I argue is the root of the problem here isn't homelessness, but it's poverty. And again, the first reason why you should negate is because it's unsustainable and it won't actually be able to carry out in the long run. Look to China, which has a government control of the housing, and economics professors Yang and Chen argue in 2014 that this leads to a low supply of housing and an unsustainable economic burden. South Africa, which has a right to housing, sees that there is a dependency syndrome, and the Human Settlements Minister said we cannot carry this out anymore. Secondly, you're actually going to lead to a worse economic downturn because, as Vanessa Brown-Calder of the Cato Institute argues in 2017, there'll be less incentive to work, which leads to a reduced labor force and harms the economy and productivity as a whole. This creates a safety hammock rather than a safety net that actually increases dependency on the government and sustains people in poverty. Lastly, there's better alternatives, which I'll get to in my next speech. For example, you have to look at how the private market is better suited to solve this problem.
Just a quick question. What happens when the economy is damaged?
I would argue that it is worse off for most people and that people aren't able to get the care that they need, or it'll lead to a lower quality of life.
Okay, so my opponent does care about quality of life, and it doesn't make any sense to leave homeless people out to dry. First, he says focus on poverty. I'm the only side in this debate round that's doing something about that. Homeless people disproportionately are in poverty. If anything, they have the most poverty. There are people that have literally nothing. They don't have a place to live. So let's guarantee them a right to housing because that does something about it. Second, he says this is unsustainable. My response is contradictory argument. To say we shouldn't provide housing now because eventually in the future we'll have to stop providing housing and that's bad doesn't make any sense. Let's at least do what we can now. My second response is other countries different. My opponent gives examples from other countries. However, an official from the Housing and Urban Development has already said that it only costs $20 billion to solve. Remember, we spend over 30 times that on education. We spend literally $634 billion on education every year. We can't spend $20 billion on housing. That's unreasonable. Economic burden, well, the economy is only a good thing to protect because it helps quality of life. So if we're directly doing that with the homeless, then it's a good thing.
Can you read to me a little more of that study that said it's $20 billion? Give me more context so I can dispute it.
Sure, I can pull it up right here. The cost of eliminating homelessness. I'll post the link in the bottom. I mean, I'm pulling it up right now, but yeah, the estimate is it would cost $20 billion for the 500,000 people that are homeless to provide them housing.
Okay. I believe that is specific to chronic homelessness, and people who are in chronic homelessness have a larger cost to society than people who are homeless that aren't chronic homelessness. So I would dispute this. I'm not able to see it right now. So that's something. When I argue that it's unsustainable, again, the reason why this is an important argument here is because if you're not able to guarantee the right in the future, then you're going to make the economy worse off in the future, then you're actually going to make it harder for this kind of work to be done or for people to guarantee housing. Additionally, I'd say that there are better alternatives in the private market. When you look to the example of New York has so much money put into homelessness and trying to solve homelessness, but there's so much homelessness there. Why? Because of excessive rent regulation and because the private market is hindered from being able to work in this case. I argue, he says that when economic downturn is hard, the purpose of economic mobility is in order to benefit quality of life. Here, I'm arguing that the economy as a whole will be harmed, which means that I'll get into my next speech.
Okay, so all the arguments on sustainability and it won't work don't apply here. We've already analyzed we are spending less than 1/30 of what we currently spend on education. $20 billion in taxpayer budgetary concerns is next to nothing. So my opponent can't say it's unsustainable, it hurts the economy. He has no links to America. He has no links on how spending $20 billion, I mean, goodness sakes, we spend over $500 billion on our military. My opponent probably doesn't have an issue with that. Why is $20 billion to solve homelessness an issue? The article's in the bottom, and I want you to mention its title. We can literally solve homelessness with the amount of money that we spend on Christmas presents. I suggest that we give the gift that keeps on giving, and that's a higher quality of life, lower mental health issues, and a better life for the homeless.
Okay, I'm just gonna read through this real quick. Okay, so first on the argument that it's not legally enforceable. Again, the argument here is that if you give a right to housing, it'll increase dependency on the government, and the government will have a housing shortage because of its control on the market, and because the market supply won't align with market demand. Again, he says that other countries aren't applicable, but when we see that it's never been actually tested in America, he has no reason why this is. I provided reasons as to why it is unsustainable, because people become more dependent on the government in order to accrue this housing. Again, I'm going to argue that it'll increase worse conditions, because when you look at examples of public housing in America, in Philadelphia, they empirically found that crime spread and decreased when the public housing was destroyed. Additionally, you have to see how there will be economic downturn because of a lessened incentive to work, because if you're going to be able to get a house without having to work for it, there's lessened incentive to work, which reduces the labor force, which hurts the economy and the quality of life as a whole.
The arguments on pragmatism cross-apply $20 billion, unless my opponent has an argument for why we literally cannot sustain a cost of $20 billion. We literally can't sustain roughly 3.7% of what we spend on education. He doesn't have an argument on pragmatism. We know this is fine. We know it will work. It's not that much money. Solving 500,000 people's lack of homes is not unsustainable and not impossible. Regardless of what other countries do with their budgets, that's their concern. We're focusing on America. Lastly, he says dependency on government. My first response is, why is the government here? Everything the government does is a benefit to us. I mean, yeah, I'm dependent on the government to make sure that an axe murderer doesn't get to kill my family and walk away scot-free. That doesn't make me a worse person. We shouldn't work back from, oh, well, let the homeless work a little bit harder and then maybe they'll get their house. These are people that are dying right now, people that are stuck in drugs and crime, people that are stuck committing suicide at disproportionately higher rates. And the cruelty of saying, well, the homeless people should be pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Come on, let's give them a right to housing. You can have them work more later, but they can't do anything when they're sleeping on the streets.
Okay, first I looked at the article and I traced it to the New York Times article that it came from, and it was focused on homelessness, which is a very small population of the homeless population as a whole. So if he is really going to guarantee a right to housing, he's not going to be able to do it for the entirety with just of the homeless population with just $20 billion. I'd like to point that out. Secondly, the reason why it's not legally enforceable is that, again, it's unsustainable in that, again, it'll cause an economic strain on the economy, and the government is not suited to do this. If you look to the example of New York again, how they fund so much government, they fund so much homelessness, trying to reduce homelessness, again, but the government intervention here actually poses a harm because the people who need the housing actually aren't able to get it. What I'm arguing is that the private markets can solve better. It's more efficient, again, if you put money into housing, 70% of it goes into housing if you work through the private market, whereas the number is only 30%, as according to Vanessa Brown-Calder of the Cato Institute. I'll pass the mic.
Here don't make sense. Saying people who need housing won't get it is the opposite of the resolution. The resolution says that we should provide a right to housing, not that we should provide and then just kidding, not provide it. That makes no sense. Also, he says the private market works. Then why isn't it working now? We have a private market for housing. 500,000 people are homeless right now. Why is that happening if the private market solves? Lastly, New York. Yeah, New York had difficulty because it didn't spend enough money on the homeless. It's not that the homeless people will just start multiplying after you give them free housing. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so first, again, he says that private markets would solve. Oh, why wouldn't private markets solve? Because the government intervention in this case, after they implemented this more money into housing, it actually increased the amount of homelessness in the short term, and in the long term, they're still not able to solve this homelessness. Secondly, I argue that it is unsustainable. He provides no evidence as to why guaranteeing a right to housing actually works. I provided reasoning, although from other countries that have a right to housing, that show that it fails because of empirical studies with supply and demand, and also a dependency syndrome. It'll increase the dependency on the government so that people aren't able to get the care they need. Additionally, it'll lead to long-term economic downturn because of lessened incentive to work, and it'll reduce the labor force, which harms the economy as a whole. This leads to a safety hammock. You have to realize that poverty will only be sustained. People will only become more dependent on the government.
So the big argument, all I've said is curing homelessness is a good thing. My opponent might damage the economy a little. It might make things harder. It might make people dependent. Look, we have a choice here. Either do something about the 500,000 people that have disproportionately higher life problems and quality of life, or accept that maybe some vague economic harm will come someday because we spent 3.7% of what we spent on education. Look, housing is easy to solve. It's good and it's moral. That's